KUAM News Hotspot is presented by Calvo Enterprises, Inc.
Howdy everyone, and welcome to The Hub. I'm Nestor Lecanto, and this week we're going to talk about the U.S. Department of Labor's new proposed regulations, and it's what could be some very significant impacts to Guam, and we've got a very great panel here of experts to talk all about it. We have down furthest to my left is attorney Mike Pangilinan, a partner in Calvo Jacob Pangilinan Law Firm. Sorry, Mike. We have Daphne Leon Guerrero, the People Director at AK, and of course Kate Gale, who is the Executive Director of the Guam Employers Council. Thanks for joining us to talk about this very important topic. Let me start with you, Mike, kind of set the table for us. What exactly is it that the U.S. DOL is proposing with regard to wages on Guam and in the other parts of the United States?
So the law that most people are familiar with that governs the employment relationship, and the reason why most people are familiar with this law is because almost everyone works, or they have a business where they have employees. And it's the law called the Fair Labor Standards Act, and that is the law that requires that employers pay minimum wage and that they pay overtime to employees that work overtime more than 40 hours in a work week. But there is a part of the law that also allows you to pay salaried exempt employees. And salaried exempt employees are paid according to certain standards and requirements for determining whether they can be considered salaried exempt. And one of those requirements is that they have to be paid over a certain amount of a salary level. And so the proposed rule by the U.S. Department of Labor is to increase that minimum salary level to a higher level. And there is a certain salary level that's applicable to Guam and the territories, and that right now is $23,660. That's the minimum that you can pay a salaried employee. You have to pay at least that amount in order for them to be considered salaried exempt from overtime. The U.S. Department of Labor has a different standard throughout the rest of the country, the states and the District of Columbia. It's at $35,000 that you have to pay for the minimum salary, but they're looking to increase it. So they've announced on September 8th a proposed rule to increase the salary level to $55,068 as a minimum that you have to pay for a salaried exempt employee. So that's a huge increase across the country, but especially for Guam, that's more than double of what the current salary level is. So that's what's on the table. We just finished a 60-day public comment period where the U.S. Department of Labor collects comments from the public. A lot of comments were submitted, and the rule now is under consideration by the Department of Labor. And if they decide to enact and issue the final rule, it'll probably be issued sometime next year. There's no time frame on when that would be, but we're expecting at some point next year for them to announce that they're going to issue a final rule, and then we'll be probably in a period of time where there may be legal challenges. So it's unclear as to when it's going to actually be implemented, but that's what's under consideration.
Yeah. And I should mention that all of you are members of SHRM, the Society for Human Resources Management, so you have a very keen interest in this. In particular, let me ask you, Daphne and Kate, to comment on the implications of this on local businesses. And Guam, of course, is predominantly small business. So
Right.
let me start with you, Daphne.
Definitely. And so what the SHRM Guam chapter did is we surveyed our membership. And of those members surveyed, almost half of them belong to really small businesses, so with 100 employees or less. And then the estimated impact of making these changes, if they were to move everyone who is under that threshold of $55,068 to that threshold, would be about $100,000 to $500,000 on an annual basis for these employers. Now imagine, as a small business, an additional operational expense of $100,000 to $500,000 for your workforce. That's not small change. So it can be very impactful, especially to those small businesses on island, to navigate these changes if they were to be enacted.
And Kate?
Yeah, same. It's just such an unprecedented increase, actually, for the whole U.S. and the history in terms of the DOL and implementing increases in minimum wage. And again, for Guam and for the other territories, because the other territories are in the same boat that Guam is in, it's over 130% increase. So there's, I mean, the premise of increases in the minimum wage is absolutely, appropriate for economies every so often. but to more than double for an area, and particularly our environment where it is predominantly smaller businesses and nonprofits are also, they are going to be hit very hard by this if it carries through in its current state. And so what our concern is, there was two big concerns is, of course, the amount, but the methodology that was used by the U.S. Department of Labor. It said that it was being very inclusive by going and using the lowest salary area in the U.S. And they stated that was the South. But in fact, in the same document, in the proposal itself, it said it had no data for the territories. So in fact, it's not including, all of the United States. If we talk, we're part of the United States as a territory in its methodology. It's just including the continental U.S. And the fact is Guam and the territories have a lower salary average just because of our economies and the way we're set up. And that the DOL said itself in the document, it's not including the territories as part of its basically research and preparation, and that it would, welcome any input, but it's saying all of this after the fact of putting. So that's our big concern is we want to be included in the methodology and something that might be more appropriate and supportive of our particular needs here as an island economy, really moved by the smaller businesses on islands.
Yeah, and in that discussion of the methodology, one size does not fit all. I mean, Guam is, we could argue, has some very unique circumstances,
Yeah, and that's the reason why the territories have, up until this point, been treated separately. The territories are located in, especially Guam, and we're geographically remote. As Kate mentioned, their salary range in Guam is lower and wages generally are lower than in the mainland. And so there's a special salary level that has been adopted and has been in place for 20 years for that reason. And so the fact that, and we understand that US DOL's rationale is they want there to be a national standard that's across the board, everyone can follow without having separate salary levels for different regions. And that's the goal. And we understand that, they like the idea of having something standardized that can apply across the country. And there may be some people that feel, well, it's not fair. Why should employees be shortchanged, in Guam just because they live in a territory means that they don't have the same protections that they have in the mainland. And I understand that point of view, but you still have to think about the fairness to the businesses. And if you're going to increase something so drastically, and what we're talking about is the minimum salary for an executive, manager, exempt salary level employee. You don't have to pay them overtime. Okay, maybe $23,660 right now, that's the level. That is kind of low, for a salaried level employee. Somebody salaried exempt that you don't have to pay overtime, that is kind of low. We understand that, and that's the position that we took as SHRM when we submitted our public comment. We said, okay, we recognize that may need a bump. It's about time for that, but not 133% increase. It's just unreasonable, and it's hard to imagine why anyone would think that that's reasonable to do to the territories. Bumping it up and incrementally is something that we would be in favor of because we think that's fair and we think that's appropriate. Given what executives and salaried exempt employees, the range that they get paid.
Yeah, just to add some clarity, maybe Daffy can give us a real life example of what the implication would be if it were.
Sure. So we did the analysis for Atkins Grohl basically, and of our total workforce, about 7% of our employees are exempt. And of those exempt employees, 37% of them fall under that threshold. And so when we did the analysis, in order to raise all of the individuals that are under that threshold to the minimum, it would cost the company about $375,000 on an annual basis. Now, as a larger company, that may not be it's still impactful, but it may not be as impactful as if it were a smaller business, maybe with 100 employees or less. I think the important thing to remember, though, is I think when people hear about this law or the proposal, they think, oh, I have to raise all of my employees to that standard if they fall under an exemption, but that's not necessarily the case. We can opt to, and I think most employers are deploying the strategy where they may raise some to that minimum, depending on the job that they do, to keep them exempt from overtime, but they may transition others from exempt to non-exempt. So then now this set of employees who were formerly exempt will now be eligible for overtime. So that is a strategy that most businesses, I think, are going to adopt, which will increase their overtime expenses potentially. But it doesn't, the ruling doesn't force us to raise everyone to that minimum. It just says in order for you to qualify to put this employee as exempt, you have to pay them at minimum $55,068.
And Kate, something's got to give, right? I mean, if you're going to have to pay more over here, something maybe fewer employees hired, or what
Yeah, and that's exactly the concern, because with such an unprecedented increase, companies and employers are working with budgets. And the simple fact is, when you're going to have increased payroll costs of anywhere up to, for some, even we've had some reported like $1 million.
Yeah.
But for our smaller businesses, it's between 100 and 500,000. That's still a significant amount, and it has to come from somewhere. So a likelihood is that there will be some adjustments in payroll in general, meaning perhaps some delayed of promotions, or perhaps some delay in hiring, or even perhaps some adjustments in the overall workforce size, meaning potentially some layoffs. And so it's just throwing this incredibly huge increase onto the backs of particularly small employers, which is what the majority of Guam is. It may have a reverse detrimental course in the sense that there's going to be money pulled from elsewhere, because it simply has to be. How else are you going to come up with such a significant amount potentially for some employers?
All right, we got to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll dig more deeper into, and I'll ask you about from the employee's perspective, okay? We'll be right back. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're speaking with Attorney Mike Pangilinan, Daphne Leon Guerrero, and Kate Gale, all of SHRM, and we're talking about proposed changes by the U.S. Department of Labor that will affect wages and salaried employees. And before we took the break, we were talking about all the implications for the businesses. But as for employees, they might be thinking, hey, this is a good thing. Why is this not good for me? Mike, you want to start us off? What are your thoughts on how would you respond to an employee who said, "Hey, I'm salaried. I'm only making $23,000. Maybe I should get paid overtime."
Well, I think that's definitely something that I think an employee may look at this potential rule change and think, well, this may be a benefit to me because my boss is probably going to want to bump me up because in order to keep me salaried exempt, because I do. If you're an employee that does management level, executive level functions, they're going to want the salaried exempt flexibility. Salaried employees don't have to clock in and clock out. They don't have to really account for their time. They like that flexibility. And somebody who is making below that 55,000 threshold, they may expect to be bumped up. But if they're making way below that 55,000 threshold, then they may be converted to to an hourly employee that's eligible for overtime. And I think a lot of employees, this is really kind of more of an issue for Kate and Daphne to talk about, but I think a lot of employees might not be happy about that. That when you're a salaried exempt employee, you're part of the executive team, and now you're going to be converted to an employee that has to punch a time clock.
Yeah.
That may be that may be a little bit demoralizing, and then that also means that you're accountable. You're a lot more accountable. You have to be reporting to your boss a lot more about what you're doing and where you're doing it, and it's just a huge additional adjustment that you have to make in the workplace that I think is going to be potentially stressful. So it may not necessarily be such a positive thing for a lot of employees that may be subject to this.
Yeah. Daphne and Kate, anecdotally, what do you think? Have you talked to employees, or have they expressed any of their thoughts?
Actually, a lot of our employers are thinking that it is going to be an impact to morale for their employees. And I think it's all about perception, right? But what we have to remember is the natural state of the employee is non-exempt. So what the FLSA says is that all employees are considered non-exempt unless proven otherwise. And there are 2 tests that we have to pass in order to qualify for that exemption so that we don't pay overtime. In my personal opinion, I do feel that it is more beneficial for an employee to receive overtime because we have, and this would be especially impactful to like middle managers or frontline managers who work a tremendous amount of hours but may not be making, they may make the 23,660 or something, a little above that, which it's very difficult to make a living at that level and not receive any overtime. So I think it would be very beneficial to those managers. It's just may take some kind of an impact to employee morale for that exemption.
Yeah. So, I mean, of course, from the employer perspective, financial is going to be a huge factor. But along with that is the morale for all these points that Mike and Daphne have been making, particularly around individuals that have been traditionally salaried. And there's a sense there is this flexibility because you're not being paid for the net hours that you're working, but for what you're giving, what you're producing for the company. And as we've all said here, we feel that yes, a change is going to come through without question in 2024 in terms of an increase of this minimum. It's just a question of the amount for the island. So there is a lot of preparation that can be done on the employer side to help with this, both financially but also the morale side. And one that we've been encouraging as a way of kind of a transition potentially is for that, like Daphne was saying, that middle management, your new manager or your first time supervisor or whatever, maybe you'll actually have a new category where you have your hourly paid and then perhaps a salaried with overtime and then a salaried. And that salaried with overtime would still just have an element of that flexibility and they would be getting a salary, but anything that went over the 40 hours per week. And the thing that's actually going to do, that might create a new dynamic in the workplace, both for the employee and the employer, where suddenly you have a group of people that are really looking at how many hours am I working here, and do I need to be doing that, right, if they're going over 40 hours, and now that we're looking at the overtime, maybe finding more innovative ways to do work to maintain the 40 hours. I mean, we saw so much innovation during COVID about how people were able to accomplish so much in a certain amount of time just because of all the various restrictions and limitations that we had. So, we say sometimes there's always, silver linings, maybe opportunities, but I think what this will find is we are going to have businesses really looking at, their productivity and how to really get the most out of what resources they have, considering the fact that this, we're going to have an increase of some sort, there's going to be this financial implication, and how best to structure my business to my employees to handle that.
Yeah, and Daph, are companies, are you recommending that companies already start socializing this with their employees?
I don't necessarily know that they need to socialize it to their employees, but we need to prepare. This is our time to be proactive, right? Do an analysis, see how much of your workforce is impacted, and then also revisit our systems, right? Are our job descriptions really reflective of the jobs that people do? Because the job description is what helps us determine if a person is exempt or non-exempt. So this is a time to prepare, I believe. Because we don't have a hard deadline on when these changes are going to be enacted. I think right now employers just need to take a more proactive approach. And then once we have all of those detailed finalized, a timeline solidified, then we can start the communication.
Okay, on that note, we need to take one more break, but when we come back, we'll talk about what SHRM is and employers in general are hoping for is an extension of time so that you can provide more input, okay? We'll be back with more of The Hub right after this. And we're back with The Hub, Attorney Mike Pangilinan, Daphne Leon Guerrero, and Kate Gale of SHRM. When we're talking, of course, about the USDOL's proposal to change some of the labor rules. Let me ask you guys, what is it that you're seeking at this point? I know the deadline has passed for input, but you're seeking an extension, Mike?
So we submitted a comment during the public comment period, the 60-day comment period. And that's required by law. Whenever there's a rule change, you have to go through this process. But 60 days is the minimum public comment period, and we think that a rule that's going to affect especially the territories with this magnitude, 133% increase, deserves more time. We deserve more time to prepare and gather data, because part of what we're trying to submit to the Department of Labor to let them understand why it's so impactful to us is, the businesses are smaller and the wages here are a little bit lower, and it has an impact on the territories, especially Guam, more so than it does in the States. But in order to make that case, you have to gather information. We had to put together a quick survey of our members at SHRM in order to have some data to report, but that's not enough. We need more time, and we think it's reasonable to extend. There's no reason to really have only the 60-day minimum. It should be longer. So that was part of what we had asked for in our public comment, in addition to, as I mentioned earlier, phasing in the increase for the territories. Don't make it so dramatic and abrupt and sudden. Make it incremental. So that's what we had asked for, and we're hoping that we get a favorable result. Most likely, they're not going to extend the comment period. So we're not, we're sort of accepting the fact that probably what we've submitted is going to be our only opportunity to comment. But we're crossing our fingers that they may give us some more time.
Yeah, Daphne, you want to add to that?
No, agreed. And it's not that we are against an increase. We're just against such a large increase. And we fully expect that the ruling will be challenged and that it may delay the implementation of the proposal. But we can anticipate that we are going to receive an increase. It just shouldn't be as large.
Well, when you say you anticipate, there is an increase, but maybe not as large, what kind of increase are we talking about?
Well, currently, I believe the salary threshold in the rest of the United States is $35,568, if I'm not mistaken. And so an increase to that level, I think, would be adequate for Guam to meet where the rest of the United States is at right now. And then maybe build up over the years to get to that 55,068. But giving our employers 60 to 90 days to comply, that I think is unreasonable, especially for such a large jump in the minimum salary threshold.
Yeah, Kate, your thoughts?
Yeah, and we as well with the Employers Council, we submitted our comments that aligned with both SHRM and with GHRA, who also submitted. And again, that key concern is in the prior time, so this has happened before, and at that time, USDOL actually sent out representatives to understand all of the territories, get the data, get the feedback before preparing the proposal. This time around, nothing at all in terms of reaching out or including any type of data or research on the territory. So that's a key concern, and that's why we've asked for this extension to gather. If the DOL can't produce that data or find that, we will gather the data and present it, because again, it's supposed to be inclusive and representative of the United States, but it's not. So we've asked for that, and we're going to work with that. But having said all that, again, it is not a done deal. We're in the proposal process. DOL will go through the comments, they'll come back. Because of that, employers do not need to make changes right now. And in fact, we caution, because with the last go around of this, some employers jumped the gun when it was still in the proposal process, made a bunch of changes, and then nothing happened. So we're still working through. Definitely you prepare, you understand what the implications might be for your business, and then wait as it works through its process. But Biden administration has signaled this is something that it's focused on, that in terms of the labor. With the election coming up, I personally, just reading all the signals, it's something they might try to ram through before election, just in case someone else gets in and it falls by the wayside. So I think we're definitely looking at action in 2024, maybe sooner than later, but definitely in 2024. So having that preparation, being prepared. And for our side, we'll keep working, to get that inclusion of the data so that there's something that might be more representative. They did make a little tweak for American Samoa. So all the territories were put in this, but for American Samoa, they gave them a little bit of a gradation of moving into it. So they've given it to American Samoa. Let's look at the other territories as well and include that.
Yeah, interesting. Politically, you're saying it might be a hot issue come next year?
Yeah, I think, Biden has made, certain labor aspects his focus, and we've seen that with the push on the union support and things. And this, I think, is along with that package. And, all the signaling, it appears he wants, maybe perhaps even his legacy, some part of his action. And so with our election year coming up, I think there might be a little bit more action from labor. Before, it's like 8 to 10 months before they get going on things. I think we might see a little bit of a shortened period, just because of the circumstances and the particular administration.
Sure, and Guam Department of Labor has a direct line to U.S. Department of Labor. Have you guys been talking with Dave Delasola about this issue?
We always communicate, and they're fully aware of all the issues. I don't know if they've taken a specific position this time around. This rule has been changed and proposed to be changed in the past. I think they were more active in the prior rule changes than they have been this time. But I know that they're aware of the issues. You know, I just want to kind of just add something to what Kate and Daphne have said, in that, you know, when you mentioned the politics of it, right? The last time something this drastic was attempted was under the Obama administration in 2016. They tried to do a rule like this, even a little bit more drastic than this, on the increase at that time, and it ended up getting challenged in court, and it ended up getting struck down, so that it never went into effect. And that's kind of what Kate is talking about. Employers jump the gun, and then nothing happens. So even if Department of Labor rushes this through, and they don't, and even like January they issue a final rule, it's likely to be challenged. And if it is challenged, I mean, it takes a while to get through a legal challenge. Even if it isn't ultimately struck down, it's going to be delayed quite a bit, and that, you know, you really never know once there's a legal challenge whether the rule will take effect or not. So I think it's just important to not panic and not jump the gun, but also not get too stressed out about it. Just take this time to kind of review your staffing, review your compliance, and just make sure that you're in compliance. That's kind of the I think the recommendation at this point.
Okay, on that note, that's a good way to end this because we're out of time. Thank you so much. Attorney Mike Pangilinan and Daphne Leon Guerrero, Kate Gale. I'm Nestor Liconda. Thanks for watching, everybody. We'll see you again next week on The Hub.